In a world where physical strength often defines worth, where muscles and endurance determine respect, one young woman would challenge everything society believed about what makes a true warrior. Her journey from the weakest recruit to an unlikely hero would not only transform her own life, but would forever change how an entire military base understood the meaning of real strength. This is not just a story about overcoming odds. It's about discovering that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with fists, but with heart, mind, and an unbreakable spirit that refuses to surrender even when everyone else has given up hope. What happens when the person everyone underestimates becomes the one person everyone needs? What happens when weakness becomes the foundation for unimaginable strength? This is the true story of Sarah Chun, and how she proved that being a soldier has nothing to do with how much you can lift, and everything to do with how much you're willing to sacrifice for others. Sarah Chun had never imagined herself in military fatigues, standing in a line with dozens of other recruits under the blazing summer sun at Fort Henderson. At 5 feet 3 inches tall and barely weighing 110 pounds, she looked more like she belonged in a library than on a military base. Her thick-rimmed glasses kept sliding down her nose, and her uniform seemed to swallow her small frame whole. While other recruits stood with confident postures and determined expressions, Sarah shifted nervously from foot to foot, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The decision to enlist had come after months of soul-searching following her father's death. Lieutenant Colonel James Chun had been a decorated war veteran who had served 3 tours overseas before retiring to become a high school history teacher. He had never pushed Sarah toward military service, knowing her gentle nature and preference for books over sports. Instead, he had encouraged her love of learning, her talent for languages, and her natural ability to solve complex problems. But when he died suddenly of a heart attack during her junior year of college, Sarah felt lost and directionless. She had been studying international relations and computer science, maintaining a perfect grade point average while working part-time at the campus library. Her professors praised her analytical mind and her ability to see patterns that others missed. Her classmates respected her intelligence, but often overlooked her in social situations. Sarah had grown comfortable being invisible, finding safety in blending into the background and letting others take the spotlight. But after her father's funeral, as Sarah sat in his study surrounded by his military commendations and photographs from his service, she felt a pull she couldn't explain. Her father had often spoken about the brotherhood of military service, about how the Army had taught him not just discipline and honor, but also about discovering strength he never knew he possessed. He had met lifelong friends during his service, men and women who had become like family. Looking at his Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals, Sarah realized she wanted to understand what had shaped the man she admired most in the world. Her mother, Linda, had been horrified when Sarah announced her intention to enlist. "Sweetheart, you've never even been camping," she had said, tears streaming down her face. "You get winded walking up the stairs to your dorm room. The military is not meant for someone like you." Her friends had been equally skeptical. "Sarah, you're brilliant," her roommate had said. "You could get into any graduate program you want. Why would you throw that away to play soldier?" But Sarah had already made up her mind. She knew she wasn't cut out for combat roles, but the Army needed intelligence analysts, linguists, and technology specialists. She spoke fluent Mandarin and Spanish, had advanced computer skills, and possessed the kind of analytical mind that could spot patterns in complex data. She convinced herself that she could serve her country in ways that played to her strengths while honoring her father's memory. The reality of basic training hit her like a physical blow from the moment she stepped off the bus. Drill Sergeant Martinez, an imposing man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter glass, took one look at Sarah and shook his head. "What do we have here?" he bellowed, circling around her like a predator sizing up prey. "Did someone's little sister get lost on her way to summer camp?" The other recruits snickered, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She tried to stand taller, but next to recruits like Jackson Miller, a former college football player who looked like he could bench press a car, or Maria Santos, a former mixed martial arts fighter with muscles that rippled under her uniform, Sarah looked like a child playing dress-up. "Sir, I'm here to serve my country, sir," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't hear you, recruit," Drill Sergeant Martinez shouted, leaning so close that Sarah could see every line of irritation on his weathered face. "Did you forget to pack your voice when you came to my army?" "Sir, I'm here to serve my country, sir," Sarah repeated, forcing her voice louder. Better, but not by much, Martinez said dismissively. Let me guess, you're going to be one of those computer nerds who thinks they can win wars from behind a desk, while real soldiers do the fighting. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her mouth shut. She had expected some hazing, but the contempt in the drill sergeant's voice was worse than anything she had imagined. As the group was marched to their barracks, she could hear whispered comments from the other recruits. She'll be gone within a week, someone said. I give her 3 days, another voice added. Poor thing looks like she's about to cry already. Sarah's bunk was in the middle of the barracks, surrounded by women who looked like they could star in action movies. Her neighbor to the left was Jessica Torres, a former police officer from Chicago whose arms were covered in tattoos that told stories of her tough upbringing in the inner city. To her right was Amanda Wright, a farm girl from Montana who could probably carry a full-grown cow if she needed to. That first night, as Sarah struggled to properly make her bed according to military standards, she could hear the other women talking and bonding over their shared backgrounds in athletics, law enforcement, and physical labor. They compared workout routines, shared stories about overcoming challenges, and discussed their plans for advancing through the ranks. Sarah had nothing to contribute to these conversations. She had never played organized sports, had never been in a physical confrontation, and had never done manual labor more demanding than shelving books. When lights went out, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, wondering if everyone was right about her chances of making it through basic training. She thought about her father and tried to imagine what advice he would give her. He had always told her that strength came in many forms, but looking around at her fellow recruits, she could only see one type of strength that seemed to matter here. The first week of training was a nightmare that seemed to never end. Every morning began at 5 with calisthenics that left Sarah gasping for breath, while others were barely breaking a sweat. She struggled through push-ups, managing only a handful while Jackson cranked out 50 without breaking rhythm. During running exercises, she fell behind almost immediately, her lungs burning as she watched the rest of her unit disappear into the distance. By the time she finally staggered across whatever finish line had been set for the day, the other recruits were already cooled down and moving on to the next activity. Drill Sergeant Martinez seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out Sarah's shortcomings. Chun, he would bellow whenever she lagged behind. Are you planning to ask the enemy to wait while you catch your breath? The comment would always draw laughter from the other recruits, and Sarah would feel her face burn with shame as she pushed herself to keep going. The obstacle course was particularly humiliating. While other recruits scaled walls and crawled under barbed wire with relative ease, Sarah struggled with every element. She couldn't pull herself over the rope climb, needed help getting over walls that others cleared with single jumps, and emerged from crawling exercises covered in mud and looking like she had been through a natural disaster. But the worst part wasn't the physical challenges, it was the growing isolation. During mealtimes, Sarah found herself eating alone while the other recruits formed tight groups, bonding over their shared experiences of success. They would discuss technique and offer each other encouragement, but no one offered to help Sarah improve. She had become the weak link that everyone wanted to avoid being associated with. Maybe you should consider a different career path, Jessica Torres said to her one evening as Sarah struggled to clean her rifle properly. There's no shame in admitting when something isn't for you. Yeah, you could probably get discharged on medical grounds, Amanda Wright added, not unkindly. Save yourself a lot of pain and embarrassment. Even the drill sergeants seemed to have written her off. During weapon training, Sergeant Foster barely glanced at Sarah's targets, which consistently showed poor groupings compared to the tight clusters achieved by other recruits. During tactical exercises, she was often given support roles or asked to observe rather than participate actively. Sarah began to spend her rare free time alone, often sitting in the chapel or walking the perimeter of the base while others engaged in group activities. She would call her mother from the pay phone, and Linda would always ask the same question. Are you ready to come home yet, sweetheart? The question haunted Sarah because she wasn't sure of the answer. Every rational part of her mind told her that she was in over her head, that she was holding back her unit and disappointing everyone around her. She had no natural athletic ability, no background in physical confrontation, and no experience with the kind of aggressive competitiveness that seemed to define military culture. But something deeper kept her going. When she looked at her father's photograph, which she kept tucked in her footlocker, she remembered all the stories he had told her about soldiers who had overcome impossible odds through determination and intelligence. He had spoken about men and Women who had found ways to contribute that went beyond physical prowess, who had saved lives and changed outcomes through quick thinking and unwavering commitment. Sarah also began to notice things that others missed. During tactical exercises, she could spot patterns in the scenarios that indicated how they were meant to be solved. When other recruits struggled with map reading and navigation, Sarah found these tasks came naturally to her. She began to realize that while she was failing at the obvious measures of military success, she possessed skills that could be valuable if she could find ways to apply them. The turning point came during the third week, when the unit was given their first major field exercise. They were divided into squads and tasked with reaching a series of checkpoints while carrying full packs and completing challenges along the way. Sarah was assigned to Squad Charlie, led by Jackson Miller, who made no effort to hide his displeasure at having the unit's weakest member on his team. "Just try not to slow us down too much," he said as they prepared to move out. "We're going for the fastest time, and we can't afford to babysit." Sarah nodded silently, adjusting the straps on her pack, which felt like it weighed more than she did. As the squad began moving through the forest, she fell behind almost immediately, struggling with the weight of her equipment and the uneven terrain. But as they progressed, Sarah began to notice things that the others missed in their focus on speed and physical performance. At the second checkpoint, the squad was given a puzzle involving radio frequencies and coded messages that needed to be deciphered to receive their next set of coordinates. While Jackson and the others stared at the equipment in frustration, Sarah stepped forward quietly and began working with the radio. Within minutes, she had decoded the message and identified the correct frequency. "How did you do that?" asked Maria Santos, staring at Sarah with surprise. "I studied cryptography in college," Sarah replied simply, writing down the coordinates. "And I noticed the pattern in the interference. It was actually part of the code." The squad reached their next checkpoint ahead of the other teams, but Sarah knew that her moment of contribution would quickly be forgotten when they resumed the physical challenges. As they prepared to move out again, she caught Jackson looking at her with something that might have been respect, but the moment passed quickly when she stumbled under the weight of her pack just a few steps into their next march. That night, as the squads made camp in the field, Sarah lay in her sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the forest and thinking about her place in this world she had chosen to enter. She knew she might never be the strongest or the fastest, but she was beginning to understand that maybe she didn't need to be. Her father had always told her that every soldier brought something unique to the fight, and perhaps her role was different from what she had imagined. The real test, she realized, wouldn't be whether she could keep up with the others in push-ups or obstacle courses. The real test would be whether she could find a way to contribute meaningfully to something larger than herself, and whether she had the courage to keep trying even when everyone around her had given up on her potential. As she drifted off to sleep under the stars, Sarah made a quiet promise to herself. She would not quit, no matter how many people laughed at her weakness. She would find a way to prove that strength came in forms that couldn't be measured by physical standards, and she would honor her father's memory by becoming the soldier he had always believed she could be, even if she hadn't believed it herself. The fourth week of basic training brought an unexpected change in routine that would alter the trajectory of Sarah's military experience forever. Captain Rebecca Hayes, the base intelligence officer, arrived at the training compound to observe the recruits during a complex scenario involving simulated combat operations and information gathering. Unlike the drill sergeants who focused primarily on physical performance and following orders, Captain Hayes was looking for different qualities: analytical thinking, pattern recognition, and the ability to process information under pressure. Sarah had no idea that her performance during the radio decoding exercise had been noted and reported up the chain of command. While she continued to struggle through physical training each morning, often finishing dead last in runs, and requiring assistance with obstacle course elements that others completed effortlessly, her quiet competence with technical challenges had not gone completely unnoticed. The scenario that Captain Hayes had designed was more complex than anything the recruits had faced before. Each squad was given incomplete intelligence reports, intercepted communications in multiple languages, and tactical maps with deliberate errors and omissions. Their task was to piece together accurate information about enemy positions and movements, then develop a strategy for completing their mission objectives while minimizing casualties and collateral damage. Most squads approached the challenge like a straightforward military exercise, focusing on aggressive tactics and overwhelming force. They spotted the obvious clues quickly, but missed the subtle details that would make the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Squad leaders like Jackson Miller had the confidence and leadership skills to rally their teams, but they lacked the patience for detailed analysis that the scenario required. Sarah's squad was assigned to a corner of the command tent where maps and documents were spread across folding tables. While her squad mates immediately began planning assault routes and discussing weapon deployments, Sarah found herself drawn to the intercepted communications. The messages were written in a mixture of English, Spanish, and what appeared to be coded references that made no immediate sense. "Chun, stop wasting time with those papers," Jackson said impatiently. "We need to figure out how to hit this target before the other squads beat us to it." But Sarah had already noticed something that made her stomach turn. Hidden within the coded messages was information indicating that the supposed enemy position was actually a civilian refugee camp, and the weapons cache that intelligence reports suggested they should target was actually a medical supply depot serving displaced families. The scenario was testing whether the squads would rush into action based on incomplete information or take the time to verify intelligence before acting. "Wait," Sarah said quietly, looking up from the documents. "I think we need to reconsider our target." "What are you talking about?" Maria Santos asked, moving over to look at the papers Sarah was studying. Sarah pointed to specific phrases in the intercepted communications. "These references to little flowers and white bandages aren't code names for weapons. They're talking about children and medical supplies. And look at this." She showed them a tactical map where she had marked inconsistencies between the supposed enemy positions and the civilian infrastructure indicators that were buried in the fine details. "You're overthinking this," Jackson said dismissively. "The objective is clear. We go in, neutralize the threat, and secure the area. That's what soldiers do." "But what if we're wrong?" Sarah pressed. "What if rushing in gets innocent people killed?" The argument might have continued, but Captain Hayes had been quietly observing their discussion from across the tent. She approached the squad with a neutral expression, but Sarah noticed that her eyes were focused intently on the documents and notes spread across their table. "What's your assessment, recruit?" Captain Hayes asked, addressing Sarah directly. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized that everyone in the tent was now watching their interaction. This was the first time a senior officer had solicited her opinion on anything, and she could sense the skepticism from her squad mates and the other recruits in the area. "Ma'am, based on the communication intercepts and cross-referencing the intelligence reports with the geographical data, I believe the target location is a civilian refugee camp rather than an enemy position," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "The tactical advantages of the position make no sense for a military installation, but they would be perfect for protecting civilians. And the supply movements described in the reports match humanitarian aid distribution patterns rather than weapons smuggling." Captain Hayes nodded slowly, making notes on her clipboard. "Continue." "Ma'am, I recommend conducting reconnaissance to verify civilian presence before any military action. If confirmed, we should establish a perimeter to protect the refugees and investigate how our intelligence was compromised, because either we received bad information or this is a test of our decision-making under pressure." The tent had grown completely silent. Even Drill Sergeant Martinez, who had appeared at some point during Sarah's briefing, was listening intently. Jackson Miller looked like he had been hit by a truck. Realizing that the recruit he had written off as hopeless had just identified complexities in the scenario that he had completely missed. "Outstanding analysis, Recruit Chun," Captain Hayes said, making a final note on her clipboard. "Your squad will receive full credit for proper intelligence verification and ethical decision-making under pressure." As Captain Hayes moved on to evaluate other squads, Sarah found herself surrounded by squad mates who were looking at her with expressions ranging from surprise to grudging respect. She had spent weeks being the weak link that held them back, and suddenly, she had become the person who potentially saved them from a catastrophic mistake. "How did you see all that when the rest of us missed it?" Amanda Wright asked, genuinely curious. "I guess I just read things differently," Sarah replied, still processing what had just happened. "My father always said that the most important battles are often fought with information rather than weapons." That evening, as the squads returned to barracks after the exercise, Sarah noticed a change in how others interacted with her. People weren't suddenly treating her like a superstar, but the dismissive attitude that had characterized their previous interactions had been replaced by something closer to neutral curiosity. Jessica Torres even asked her to help interpret a letter she had received from her grandmother, who wrote primarily in Spanish. More significantly, Drill Sergeant Martinez approached Sarah during evening cleanup duties with an expression that was less openly hostile than usual. Chun, report to Captain Hayes' office tomorrow at 0800, he said without preamble. And try not to embarrass yourself more than usual. Sarah spent the night wondering what Captain Hayes might want to discuss. She had heard stories about recruits being called in for counseling sessions when they were being considered for early discharge, and despite the success of the day's exercise, she wasn't sure if one good performance was enough to outweigh weeks of physical failures. The intelligence office was located in a different part of the base, away from the training facilities where Sarah spent most of her time. As she walked across the compound in her dress uniform, she passed groups of more advanced trainees engaged in specialized training exercises. Some were practicing urban warfare techniques, others were working with advanced communications equipment, and still others were engaged in what appeared to be computer-based simulations. Captain Hayes' office was small but filled with an impressive array of maps, technical manuals, and computer equipment. The walls were covered with photographs from various military operations, academic certificates, and commendations that suggested a career built on intelligence work rather than traditional combat roles. Sit down, Chun, Captain Hayes said without looking up from the report she was reading. Tell me about your educational background. Sarah provided a summary of her college studies, her language skills, and her experience with computer systems and data analysis. Captain Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but maintaining a neutral expression that gave Sarah no indication of whether the interview was going well or poorly. Your performance during yesterday's exercise was exceptional, Captain Hayes said finally. You demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking and attention to detail that we need in intelligence operations. However, your physical performance during basic training has been problematic. Sarah felt her heart sink. She had allowed herself to hope that maybe her intellectual contributions could compensate for her physical limitations, but it seemed that military standards were military standards regardless of other abilities. Ma'am, I understand that I haven't met the physical standards expected of recruits, Sarah said. But I'm committed to improving, and I believe I can contribute to the mission in other ways. The question isn't whether you can contribute, Captain Hayes replied. The question is where you can contribute most effectively. Traditional infantry roles require physical capabilities that you may never develop, regardless of your dedication and effort. But intelligence work requires capabilities that most soldiers never develop, regardless of their physical prowess. Captain Hayes pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk between them. I'm recommending you for accelerated placement in the Military Intelligence Corps after you complete basic training. You would receive specialized training in intelligence analysis, signals intercepts, and strategic planning. Your language skills and analytical abilities would be significant assets in these roles. Sarah stared at the folder, hardly believing what she was hearing. Ma'am, does this mean I wouldn't have to complete the physical requirements for infantry training? You would still need to meet basic physical fitness standards for all military personnel, Captain Hayes explained. But the emphasis would be on your intellectual capabilities rather than your ability to carry a 100-pound pack through 20 miles of rough terrain. Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by excitement about the possibility of serving in a role that actually matched her strengths. For weeks, she had been trying to force herself into a mold that didn't fit, convinced that being a good soldier meant excelling at things she had no natural ability to do. However, Captain Hayes continued, there are conditions. You still need to complete basic training with your current unit. No special accommodations, no reduced physical requirements. You need to prove that you can meet minimum standards and function as part of a team, even when that team doesn't initially appreciate what you bring to the table. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was both an opportunity and a challenge. She would need to continue struggling through the physical aspects of training while proving that her intellectual contributions were valuable enough to warrant a specialized assignment. Also, Captain Hayes added, I want you to start attending evening briefings with my intelligence team. You'll observe real-world intelligence operations and begin learning the practical applications of analytical techniques. Consider it supplemental education. As Sarah left Captain Hayes' office, she felt lighter than she had since arriving at the base. For the first time, she could see a clear path toward becoming the kind of soldier her father would have been proud of. She wasn't going to become a combat hero who stormed enemy positions and earned medals for valor under fire. Instead, she was going to become someone who prevented disasters through careful analysis and accurate information. The remaining weeks of basic training took on a completely different character for Sarah. she still struggled with physical challenges, and she still finished last in most competitive exercises. But now she had context for her efforts that made the struggle feel worthwhile. Every push-up she managed to complete was preparing her for a career where physical fitness was important, but not defining. Every obstacle she eventually overcame was building the mental toughness she would need for intelligence work, where the obstacles were often more complex and less obvious than physical barriers. The evening intelligence briefings became the highlight of Sarah's day. Captain Hayes introduced her to the complex world of military intelligence, where success was measured not by how quickly you could neutralize threats, but by how effectively you could identify and understand them before they became critical. She learned about signals intelligence, human intelligence, and the art of piecing together accurate assessments from incomplete and sometimes contradictory information. Sarah discovered that many of the greatest intelligence victories in military history had been achieved not through superior firepower, but through superior analysis. Codebreakers had shortened wars by years. Analysts had prevented conflicts by identifying diplomatic solutions. Intelligence officers had saved thousands of lives by accurately assessing threats and recommending appropriate responses. More importantly, Sarah began to understand how her role as an intelligence analyst could multiply the effectiveness of soldiers like Jackson Miller and Maria Santos. Her job would be to ensure that when they were put in harm's way, they had accurate information about what they were facing and the best possible strategies for achieving their objectives while minimizing risks. The change in Sarah's outlook was noticed by her fellow recruits, though they didn't initially understand what had caused it. She still struggled with physical training, but she no longer seemed defeated by those struggles. When she fell behind during runs, she would catch up eventually and move on to the next challenge without the dejected attitude that had characterized her earlier weeks. During tactical exercises, Sarah began speaking up more frequently, offering observations and suggestions that other recruits found valuable. Her squad mates started including her in planning discussions, recognizing that she often spotted problems and solutions that they missed in their focus on direct action approaches. By the end of basic training, Sarah had managed to meet minimum physical standards for graduation, though she remained far from the top of her class in athletic performance. What had changed dramatically was her understanding of her own value and potential contribution to military operations. She had found her place in an institution that had initially seemed designed to exclude people like her. The graduation ceremony was both an ending and a beginning for Sarah. As she stood in formation with her fellow recruits, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day when Drill Sergeant Martinez had compared her to someone's little sister who had gotten lost on the way to summer camp. She was still the same small, intellectual young woman who preferred books to physical confrontation. But now she understood that those characteristics weren't weaknesses to be overcome. They were strengths to be developed and applied in service of something larger than herself. Her father had been right about the military teaching soldiers to discover strength they never knew they possessed. Sarah had discovered that her strength lay not in her body, but in her mind, and that this strength could be just as valuable to her country and her fellow soldiers as any display of physical prowess. 6 months after graduating from basic training, Sarah found herself in a world that was simultaneously more challenging and more suited to her abilities than anything she had experienced during her initial military training. The Intelligence Analysis Center at Fort Braxton was a sprawling complex of secure buildings filled with the most advanced technology the military had to offer. Here, young analysts worked alongside seasoned intelligence professionals to process information that could affect military operations around the globe. Sarah's new environment was a striking contrast to the mud and obstacle courses of basic training. Her workspace consisted of multiple computer monitors, secure communication equipment, and analysis software that could process vast amounts of data from satellites, intercepted communications, and human intelligence sources. Instead of drill sergeants shouting orders, she worked under the guidance of experienced analysts who valued quiet concentration and methodical thinking. Her supervisor was Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, a veteran intelligence analyst who had spent 15 years developing expertise in Middle Eastern affairs. Sergeant Williams had a reputation for being demanding but fair, and for developing some of the most skilled analysts in the military. She had specifically requested Sarah for her team after reviewing reports from Captain Hayes about her performance during basic training. "Chun, forget everything you learned about military hierarchy when you're working analysis," Sergeant Williams told her during their first meeting. "In this room, the person with the best information and The most accurate assessment gets heard, regardless of rank. Your job is to be right, not to be popular or to follow orders without thinking. This philosophy was both liberating and terrifying for Sarah. During basic training, success had been defined by following instructions perfectly and meeting predetermined standards. In intelligence work, success was defined by independently arriving at conclusions that could save lives or prevent disasters. The responsibility was enormous, and Sarah quickly learned that the stakes of her work were far higher than anything she had faced during training exercises. Her first major assignment involved analyzing communication intercepts from a region where terrorist groups were suspected of planning attacks against civilian targets. The intercepted messages were fragmented, often coded, and frequently written in dialects that even experienced translators found challenging. Sarah's role was to identify patterns in the communications that might reveal the timing, location, or nature of planned operations. For weeks, Sarah immersed herself in the intercepted messages, creating complex charts and databases to track relationships between different speakers, recurring phrases that might be coded references, and timing patterns that could indicate operational planning. She worked 12-hour days, often forgetting to eat meals as she became absorbed in the puzzle of understanding what the messages revealed about terrorist intentions. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that what other analysts had interpreted as religious references were actually geographical markers. Phrases about visiting the house of the prophet and gathering for evening prayers were coded references to specific locations and meeting times. When she mapped these references against known terrorist safe houses and operational patterns, a clear picture emerged of a planned coordinated attack against 3 different targets. "Williams, you need to see this," Sarah said, calling her supervisor over to review her analysis. It was 2 in the morning, and most of the intelligence center was empty except for the overnight shift, but Sarah had been too excited by her discovery to wait until morning. Sergeant Williams studied Sarah's charts and analysis for several minutes, occasionally asking questions about specific conclusions and requesting clarification about how Sarah had interpreted particular pieces of evidence. When she finished her review, she immediately picked up a secure phone and began making calls to alert higher command levels about the threats Sarah had identified. Within hours, Sarah's analysis had triggered a coordinated international operation involving multiple intelligence agencies and military units. Special forces teams were deployed to intercept the terrorist cells before they could execute their attacks, while diplomatic channels were activated to coordinate with allied governments in the affected regions. The operation was a complete success. All 3 terrorist cells were captured before they could carry out their planned attacks, and interrogations confirmed that Sarah's analysis of the intercepted communications had been completely accurate. Conservative estimates suggested that her work had prevented attacks that could have killed dozens of innocent civilians. "Outstanding work, Chun," Sergeant Williams told her the following morning as they reviewed reports from the successful operations. "Your analysis was the key that unlocked this entire network. You should be proud of what you accomplished." Sarah felt a satisfaction unlike anything she had experienced during basic training. When she had successfully completed obstacle courses or met physical fitness requirements, the accomplishment had felt personal and somewhat hollow. This success felt meaningful in a way that connected directly to her sense of purpose in joining the military. She had prevented real harm to real people by using skills that were uniquely hers. However, Sarah soon learned that success in intelligence work brought its own set of challenges. As word of her analytical skills spread through the intelligence community, she began receiving assignments that were increasingly complex and sensitive. Senior officers who had never paid attention to a junior analyst began requesting her input on high-priority cases. The pressure of knowing that her assessments could influence major military and diplomatic decisions was both exciting and overwhelming. More challenging was the isolation that came with her specialized role. During basic training, Sarah had struggled to fit in, but she had been part of a clearly defined group with shared experiences and challenges. In the intelligence world, she worked with small teams of highly specialized professionals who were often much older and more experienced. While they respected her analytical abilities, she had little in common with them outside of work. Sarah also discovered that intelligence work required emotional resilience that was different from, but no less demanding than, the physical resilience required of combat soldiers. She regularly processed information about human trafficking, terrorist attacks, and military conflicts that revealed the worst aspects of human nature. Learning to compartmentalize this information and maintain her mental health while remaining professionally effective required constant effort. The real test of Sarah's character and abilities came during her 8th month at the Intelligence Center, when she was assigned to a case that would challenge everything she believed about moral decision-making in military contexts. Intelligence sources had identified a terrorist leader who was responsible for orchestrating attacks that had killed hundreds of civilians. The terrorist was hiding in a remote compound that also housed his extended family, including several young children. Military planners were developing options for capturing or eliminating the terrorist leader, but each approach involved significant risks. A direct assault could result in civilian casualties, including the deaths of innocent children. Waiting for the terrorist to leave the compound might allow him to escape or to carry out additional attacks. Sarah's job was to analyze all available intelligence and provide an assessment that could inform the decision about how to proceed. The assignment forced Sarah to confront the reality that her analytical work wasn't just an academic exercise in problem-solving. Her assessment would directly influence decisions about who lived and who died, and there were no perfect solutions that would eliminate all risks and moral complications. Sarah spent days reviewing satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and intelligence reports about the compound and its occupants. She analyzed the terrorist leader's behavioral patterns, studied the layout of the building for potential approaches that might minimize civilian casualties, and researched the backgrounds of family members to assess their potential involvement in terrorist activities. Her final report presented multiple options with detailed analysis of the risks and probable outcomes associated with each approach. She identified times when the terrorist leader was most likely to be isolated from family members, weaknesses in the compound's security that could be exploited by special forces, and alternative strategies for drawing the terrorist away from the civilian-occupied areas. Most importantly, Sarah's report included a recommendation that reflected her own moral assessment of the situation. She argued for a patient approach that would wait for an opportunity to capture the terrorist leader without risking civilian casualties, even though this approach carried the risk that he might escape or conduct additional attacks while they waited for the right moment. Chun, are you confident in this recommendation? Sergeant Williams asked after reviewing the report. You're essentially arguing that we should accept the risk of additional terrorist attacks in order to avoid the certainty of civilian casualties in a direct assault. Yes, Sergeant, Sarah replied. Based on the intelligence available, I believe that patient surveillance offers the best chance of achieving the mission objectives while minimizing harm to innocent people. I understand the risks involved, but I think they're justified given the moral considerations. Sarah's recommendation was forwarded up the chain of command, where it was considered alongside input from military tacticians, legal advisors, and policy experts. The decision ultimately made was to implement the patient surveillance approach that Sarah had recommended, with special forces teams positioned to act when an opportunity presented itself to capture the terrorist leader without endangering his family. The operation required 3 weeks of careful monitoring before the opportunity Sarah had predicted finally materialized. The terrorist leader left the compound alone to meet with associates in a nearby town, where he was captured by special forces without incident. The operation was a complete success, with the terrorist leader in custody and no civilian casualties. But the weeks of waiting had taken an emotional toll on Sarah. Every day that passed without action was a day when the terrorist leader might have been planning additional attacks or coordinating with other cells. Sarah found herself wondering if innocent people were dying elsewhere because of her recommendation to avoid immediate action against the compound. The doubt and moral complexity of the situation taught Sarah important lessons about the psychological demands of intelligence work. Unlike the clear-cut challenges of basic training, where success was measured by objective standards, intelligence work often required making decisions based on incomplete information and competing moral considerations. The weight of responsibility for those decisions was something that no amount of training could fully prepare someone to handle. Chun, you need to understand something about this job, Sergeant Williams told her after the successful conclusion of the operation. We make decisions based on the best information available at the time, and we accept responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. But we can't torture ourselves by second-guessing every choice or imagining all the things that might have gone differently. How do you handle knowing that your assessments affect whether people live or die? Sarah asked. By focusing on doing the best possible job with the information I have, and by remembering that the alternative to intelligence-guided decision-making is blind action that usually results in much worse outcomes, Sergeant Williams replied. Your recommendation saved innocent lives while still achieving the mission objective. That's exactly what good intelligence analysis should accomplish. As Sarah continued to develop her skills and take on increasingly complex assignments, she began to understand that her role as an intelligence analyst was teaching her a form of strength that had nothing to do with physical capabilities. The strength required to make difficult decisions under pressure, to maintain moral clarity in ambiguous situations, and to accept responsibility for the consequences of analytical assessments was every bit as demanding as the physical strength that had initially seemed so important during basic training. She also began to understand how her work multiplied the effectiveness of soldiers like Jackson Miller and Maria Santos, who were now serving in combat units around the world. The intelligence assessments that Sarah and her colleagues provided gave these soldiers accurate information about the threats they faced and the best strategies for achieving their objectives while minimizing risks to themselves and to civilian populations. Sarah's transformation from a struggling basic training recruit to a respected intelligence analyst had taught her that military strength came in many forms. Physical courage was important for soldiers who faced direct combat, but intellectual courage was equally important for soldiers who processed difficult information and made complex assessments under pressure. Both types of strength were necessary for military success, and both deserved respect and recognition. The young woman who had once been dismissed as too weak for military service had found her place in an organization that valued her unique contributions. She had proven that strength wasn't just about how much weight you could lift or how fast you could run. It was about how much responsibility you could handle and how effectively you could serve something larger than yourself. 18 months into her intelligence career, Sarah faced the first major crisis that would truly test everything she had learned about herself and her capabilities as a soldier. The crisis began with what appeared to be a routine assignment, analyzing communication patterns from a region where coalition forces were conducting peacekeeping operations following a civil war. The area had been relatively quiet for months, with most intelligence suggesting that former combatants were successfully transitioning to civilian life under the protection of international forces. Sarah's team was monitoring the situation to watch for signs of renewed conflict or terrorist infiltration that could destabilize the fragile peace. The assignment seemed straightforward compared to the high-stakes counterterrorism work she had been doing, and Sarah welcomed the opportunity to work on something that felt more like maintaining peace than preventing violence. However, Sarah began noticing subtle patterns in the intercepted communications that suggested something was not right in the supposedly pacified region. References to family gatherings and wedding preparations appeared with unusual frequency in messages between individuals who intelligence files indicated had no family relationships. More concerning, these references were often accompanied by discussions of gifts and celebrations that seemed inconsistent with the economic conditions in the war-torn area. "I think we might have a problem," Sarah told Sergeant Williams after spending several days analyzing the communications patterns. These coded references suggest that former combatants are reorganizing into new groups, possibly with outside support. Sergeant Williams reviewed Sarah's analysis with her usual thoroughness, but this time her response was different from the immediate validation Sarah had come to expect. "Chun, I think you might be seeing patterns that aren't there. This region has been stable for months, and our human intelligence sources confirm that former combatants are successfully reintegrating into civilian life. But these communication patterns don't match normal civilian activity," Sarah protested. "The frequency and timing of these messages suggest coordinated planning for something significant. Sometimes messages about actual family gatherings and actual wedding preparations are just messages about family gatherings and wedding preparations," Sergeant Williams replied patiently. "You've been working counterterrorism cases for months, where everything is coded and suspicious. You might need to recalibrate your analysis for a peacekeeping environment where most communications are exactly what they appear to be." Sarah felt frustrated by the dismissal of her concerns, but she respected Sergeant Williams's experience and judgment. Perhaps she was indeed seeing threats where none existed, letting her success in uncovering terrorist plots make her overly suspicious of normal civilian communications. However, Sarah couldn't shake her unease about the patterns she had identified. She continued monitoring the communications during her off-duty hours, developing increasingly detailed charts and timelines that reinforced her belief that something significant was being planned. The more data she collected, the more convinced she became that the supposedly peaceful region was about to experience a major escalation in violence. The breakthrough that confirmed Sarah's suspicions came when she identified a communication that contained a phrase she had encountered in previous counterterrorism cases. The phrase was a specific coded reference that terrorist groups use to indicate the final stages of operational planning. Finding this phrase in communications from the supposedly pacified region was like discovering a smoking gun that proved her analysis had been correct. Sarah immediately brought this discovery to Sergeant Williams, expecting that the new evidence would validate her concerns and trigger an immediate alert to coalition forces in the region. Instead, she encountered resistance that she hadn't anticipated and couldn't initially understand. "Chun, I need you to drop this line of analysis," Sergeant Williams said after reviewing the new information. "Higher command has assessed the situation in this region, and they're satisfied that the threat level remains low. Your job is to monitor for significant changes, not to argue with assessments that have already been made by more experienced analysts." "But this coded reference proves that my analysis is correct," Sarah said, feeling confused and frustrated. "We need to warn coalition forces that an attack is being planned. What we need is for you to trust the judgment of your superiors and focus on the assignments you've been given," Sergeant Williams replied with a tone that indicated the discussion was over. Sarah left the meeting feeling more confused than she had at any point since joining the intelligence community. During her previous cases, accurate analysis had been praised and immediately acted upon. Now she was being told to ignore evidence that seemed to clearly indicate an imminent threat to coalition forces and civilian populations. Over the following days, Sarah wrestled with a moral dilemma that her training had not prepared her to handle. Her professional obligation was to follow orders and trust the judgment of more experienced analysts. But her personal conviction was that people were going to die if action wasn't taken based on the intelligence she had uncovered. The situation became more complicated when Sarah learned through informal channels that her analysis was being suppressed for political reasons rather than professional ones. Coalition governments were under pressure to demonstrate that their peacekeeping mission was succeeding, and intelligence suggesting renewed instability in the region could undermine public support for continued military involvement. There are bigger considerations than just the immediate intelligence picture, an older analyst told Sarah during a private conversation. "Sometimes we have to accept that political realities affect how intelligence is used, even when we don't like those realities." "But people are going to get hurt," Sarah protested. "Isn't our job to prevent that, regardless of political considerations?" "Our job is to provide accurate intelligence to decision-makers," the analyst replied. "What they do with that intelligence involves factors that we don't always understand or control." Sarah spent sleepless nights trying to reconcile her sense of professional duty with her moral conviction that she needed to find a way to warn coalition forces about the threat she had identified. She considered going directly to Captain Hayes or even higher command levels, but she knew that bypassing the chain of command could end her military career and potentially result in criminal charges. The decision was taken out of her hands when the attack occurred exactly as her analysis had predicted. Former combatants who had supposedly reintegrated into civilian life launched coordinated attacks against 3 coalition outposts, killing 12 peacekeepers and wounding dozens more. The attacks were precisely timed and targeted, demonstrating the kind of planning and coordination that Sarah's communication analysis had indicated. In the aftermath of the attacks, Sarah's suppressed intelligence reports were suddenly taken very seriously. Emergency meetings were convened to review how the intelligence had been missed, and Sarah found herself being questioned by senior officers who wanted to understand why her warnings had not been heeded. "Chun, your analysis was completely accurate," Captain Hayes told her during one of these review sessions. "Why wasn't this intelligence acted upon?" Sarah faced another moral dilemma as she realized that her honest answer could destroy Sergeant Williams's career and expose the political considerations that had led to the suppression of her intelligence. Despite her anger and frustration about the situation, Sarah couldn't bring herself to destroy someone who had been her mentor and supporter. "Ma'am, I believe there were disagreements about the interpretation of the intelligence," Sarah said carefully. "Sometimes patterns that seem clear to one analyst aren't as obvious to others with different experience and perspectives." Captain Hayes studied Sarah's face carefully, clearly understanding that there was more to the story than Sarah was willing to reveal. "Chun, I want you to write a complete report about your analysis of this situation, including all the intelligence you gathered and the conclusions you reached. Don't worry about protecting anyone else's reputation. Just focus on providing an accurate account of what you observed and assessed. Sarah spent the next week writing the most difficult report of her military career. She documented her analysis in complete detail, showing how the communication patterns had clearly indicated coordinated planning for attacks against coalition forces. She explained how coded references had revealed the timing and targeting of the planned operations, and how her warnings had been dismissed despite the accuracy of her assessments. The report created a firestorm within the intelligence community. Senior officers demanded explanations for how such accurate intelligence had been ignored, while political leaders scrambled to understand why they had not been informed about threats to their peacekeeping forces. Several careers were effectively ended by the investigation that followed, including that of Sergeant Williams, who was transferred to a non-analytical role and effectively removed from intelligence work. Sarah felt terrible about her role in her mentor's professional downfall, even though she knew that her honest reporting had been necessary to prevent similar disasters in the future. The experience taught her that integrity in intelligence work sometimes required making choices that hurt people she cared about in service of larger principles and responsibilities. "Chun, you did the right thing," Captain Hayes told her when the investigation was completed. "Intelligence work requires absolute honesty, even when that honesty is inconvenient for political or personal reasons. The soldiers who died in those attacks deserved better intelligence support than they received, and your report helps ensure that similar failures don't happen again." But Sarah's vindication came at a personal cost that she struggled to handle. Her relationship with Sergeant Williams was permanently damaged, and other intelligence professionals began treating her with a mixture of respect and wariness, recognizing her analytical skills while questioning her loyalty to colleagues. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated within the intelligence community, respected for her abilities, but viewed as someone who couldn't be trusted to protect others when institutional pressures conflicted with professional obligations. More challenging was the psychological impact of knowing that her analysis could have prevented the deaths of 12 soldiers if it had been acted upon. Sarah found herself replaying the events over and over, wondering if she could have found a way to get the intelligence to coalition forces without going through official channels that had proven to be compromised by political considerations. "The hardest part of this job isn't analyzing the intelligence," Captain Hayes told her during one of their regular meetings. "The hardest part is living with the knowledge that intelligence failures have real human costs, and that sometimes those failures result from factors that individual analysts can't control." Sarah began to understand that her role as an intelligence analyst required forms of moral courage that were different from, but no less demanding than, the physical courage required of combat soldiers. She needed the courage to reach difficult conclusions based on incomplete information, the courage to stand by those conclusions even when they were unpopular or inconvenient, and the courage to accept responsibility for both successful operations and tragic failures. The experience also taught Sarah important lessons about the institutional challenges that intelligence professionals faced. Accurate analysis was not always enough to prevent disasters. Intelligence had to navigate political considerations, institutional rivalries, and human flaws that could interfere with even the most crucial information reaching decision-makers in time to be useful. As Sarah continued her work in the aftermath of the peacekeeping disaster, she carried with her a deeper understanding of both the importance and the limitations of her role. She had proven that her analytical skills could identify threats and save lives when the intelligence was acted upon appropriately. But she had also learned that being right was not always enough, and that serving effectively as an intelligence analyst required navigating complex institutional and political realities that extended far beyond the technical aspects of information analysis. The young woman who had once struggled to complete obstacle courses had faced a different kind of obstacle, one that required moral courage, professional integrity, and the strength to continue serving effectively even after experiencing a devastating institutional failure. In many ways, this test had been more demanding than anything she had faced during basic training, requiring her to prove not just her analytical abilities, but her character and commitment to the larger mission of protecting others through accurate intelligence work. 3 years after the peacekeeping disaster that had tested Sarah's moral courage and professional integrity, she found herself facing a situation that would require every form of strength she had developed during her military service. The call came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, waking Sarah from the light sleep that had become her norm during periods of high operational tempo. Major Richardson's voice on the secure phone was calm but urgent, conveying the kind of controlled tension that indicated a crisis of significant magnitude. "Chun, we need you at the Situation Room immediately," Major Richardson said. "Bring your go bag and plan for extended deployment. Transportation is en route to your location." Sarah had been promoted twice since the peacekeeping incident, earning recognition for her analytical abilities while building a reputation as someone who would provide honest assessments regardless of political pressure. She now led a small team of junior analysts and served as a subject matter expert on terrorism and insurgency patterns in multiple regions. Her expertise had become so valued that she was regularly called in to provide analysis for the most sensitive and complex operations. The situation that awaited Sarah at the operations center was unlike anything she had encountered in her military career. A major earthquake had devastated a region where several terrorist groups operated, creating a humanitarian crisis that was also a significant security threat. Coalition forces were being deployed to provide disaster relief, but intelligence indicated that terrorist groups were planning to exploit the chaos to launch attacks against relief workers and civilian populations. "The earthquake has created perfect conditions for terrorist operations," Major Richardson explained as Sarah reviewed initial intelligence reports. "Infrastructure is destroyed, communications are disrupted, and emergency services are overwhelmed. We have intelligence suggesting that at least 3 different terrorist groups are moving assets into the affected area to conduct operations against relief efforts." The challenge facing Sarah's team was extraordinary in its complexity. They needed to provide intelligence support for humanitarian operations while also identifying and tracking terrorist threats in an environment where normal intelligence gathering methods were severely compromised. The earthquake had destroyed communication networks, displaced populations, and created conditions where distinguishing between legitimate refugees and terrorist operatives was extremely difficult. Even more challenging was the time pressure involved. Relief operations were beginning immediately, putting thousands of aid workers and military personnel at risk if terrorist threats were not identified and neutralized quickly. Sarah's analysis would need to be both rapid and accurate, with no margin for error in an environment where mistakes could result in mass casualties. "Chun, I'm putting you in operational command of intelligence analysis for this entire operation," Major Richardson said. "You'll have access to everything we have: satellite imagery, communication intercepts, human intelligence sources, and liaison support from allied intelligence services. Your job is to keep our people alive while they try to save civilian lives." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was being asked to coordinate intelligence efforts involving hundreds of professionals across multiple agencies and countries, while providing analysis that would directly affect the safety of thousands of relief workers and millions of earthquake victims. It was the kind of responsibility that she could never have imagined accepting when she had struggled through basic training as the weakest recruit in her unit. The first major crisis came within hours of the relief operations beginning, when Sarah's team identified communication patterns suggesting that terrorists were planning attacks against a refugee camp where coalition medics were treating earthquake victims. The intelligence was fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but the patterns were consistent with pre-attack preparations that Sarah had learned to recognize during her previous cases. However, acting on incomplete intelligence could result in military forces treating legitimate refugees as enemy combatants, potentially creating the kind of civilian casualties that coalition forces were deployed to prevent. Sarah faced a decision that required balancing the risk of terrorist attacks against the risk of military mistakes that could harm innocent people who had already suffered devastating losses from the earthquake. "Ma'am, I recommend positioning special forces near the refugee camp to provide security, but not conducting preemptive operations against suspected terrorists until we have better intelligence," Sarah told Major Richardson during an emergency briefing. "The risk of civilian casualties from mistaken targeting is too high given the current intelligence picture. Chun, if you're wrong and terrorists attack that refugee camp, we could lose dozens of aid workers and hundreds of civilians," Major Richardson replied. "Are you confident enough in your assessment to accept responsibility for those potential casualties?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said, though she felt anything but confident. "Based on the available intelligence, I believe security positioning is the appropriate response until we can develop better targeting information." Sarah's recommendation was implemented, with special forces teams deployed to provide security for the refugee camp while intelligence collection efforts were intensified. The decision proved correct when additional intelligence revealed that the suspected terrorists were actually displaced families who were using coded language to coordinate with relatives in other refugee camps. Military action based on the initial intelligence would have resulted in attacks against innocent earthquake victims. But Sarah's success in preventing one potential disaster was quickly followed by a much more serious threat. Her team identified communications indicating that a major terrorist group was planning coordinated attacks against multiple aid distribution centers throughout the affected region. Unlike the previous case, this intelligence was detailed and specific, indicating that the attacks were imminent and would target both aid workers and civilian populations. The challenge was that the aid distribution centers were located in areas that were heavily populated with earthquake refugees. Military operations to prevent the terrorist attacks would need to be conducted in areas where distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants was extremely difficult, and where any mistake could result in significant civilian casualties. Sarah found herself needing to coordinate with Special Forces commanders to develop operations that could neutralize terrorist threats while minimizing risks to civilian populations. This required her to move beyond purely analytical work into operational planning that combined intelligence assessment with tactical decision-making. "We need to approach this as a rescue operation rather than an assault," Sarah explained to the Special Forces team leaders during a planning session. "The terrorists are using civilian populations as both cover and potential victims. Our objective should be to separate civilians from combatants before engaging the terrorist threat." Working with Special Forces experts, Sarah helped develop a plan that used her intelligence about terrorist positioning to create evacuation corridors that would move civilians away from planned attack sites, while positioning military forces to intercept terrorist operatives. The plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple units, with Sarah's intelligence team providing real-time updates about terrorist movements and civilian locations. The operation was the most complex military action Sarah had ever been involved in, requiring her to maintain constant communication with field commanders while processing new intelligence that could change tactical requirements from minute to minute. For 18 hours, she coordinated intelligence support for simultaneous operations across 6 different locations, managing information flow between dozens of analysts and operators while making rapid assessments that affected life and death decisions in real time. The operation was ultimately successful beyond anyone's expectations. All 6 terrorist cells were neutralized before they could conduct their planned attacks, while civilian casualties were avoided entirely. More than 200,000 earthquake refugees were successfully evacuated from areas where terrorist attacks had been planned, allowing humanitarian operations to continue without the security threats that could have ended international relief efforts. "Outstanding work, Chun," Major Richardson told Sarah when the operation was completed. "Your intelligence coordination was flawless, and your operational planning helped save thousands of lives. This is exactly the kind of performance that defines what it means to be a soldier." But Sarah's greatest test came in the aftermath of the successful operation, when she learned that one of the Special Forces soldiers killed during the operation had been Jackson Miller, her former squadmate from basic training. Jackson had volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments during the operation, leading a team that had drawn terrorist fire away from civilian evacuation routes. He had died protecting people he had never met in a foreign country, based on intelligence that Sarah had provided. The news of Jackson's death hit Sarah harder than she had expected. Despite their difficult relationship during basic training, she had followed his military career and knew that he had become exactly the kind of soldier that she had once thought she could never be. Physically courageous, tactically skilled, and completely committed to protecting others regardless of personal risk. Sarah attended Jackson's memorial service at Fort Braxton, where she was surprised to be approached by several soldiers who had served with him during various deployments. They told her that Jackson had often spoken about his basic training experience, and specifically about how much he had learned to respect Sarah's intelligence and dedication after initially dismissing her as too weak for military service. "Miller always said that you taught him that being a soldier wasn't just about being tough," Sergeant Maria Santos told Sarah after the service. "He said you showed him that the strongest soldiers were the ones who used their minds to protect other people, and that physical courage was just one part of what made someone truly strong." Sarah realized that her journey from struggling recruit to accomplished intelligence officer had been running parallel to Jackson's development from promising athlete to exceptional soldier. They had each found ways to serve that matched their individual strengths while supporting the broader military mission of protecting others. Jackson had provided physical courage and tactical leadership, while Sarah had provided analytical intelligence and strategic planning. Both forms of contribution had been essential to military success, and both had required forms of strength that deserved recognition and respect. The earthquake relief operation became a defining moment for Sarah's understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. She had proven that intellectual courage, moral integrity, and analytical skill could be just as important to military operations as physical prowess and tactical aggression. Her ability to process complex information under pressure, make difficult decisions with incomplete data, and coordinate with others to achieve shared objectives had saved thousands of lives and enabled successful completion of a mission that required every type of military capability. More importantly, Sarah had learned that strength in military service was not about individual capabilities, but about how those capabilities contributed to collective success. Her intelligence work had multiplied the effectiveness of soldiers like Jackson Miller by providing them with accurate information and strategic context for their operations. Their physical courage and tactical skills had enabled the implementation of plans that her analysis had helped develop. Neither component could have succeeded without the other. 5 years after arriving at basic training as the weakest recruit in her unit, Sarah had become someone whose strength was measured not in push-ups or obstacle course times, but in lives saved and disasters prevented through careful analysis and moral courage. She had proven that military strength came in many forms, and that the most important battles were often fought with intelligence, integrity, and the kind of quiet determination that refused to give up even when everyone else had written off the possibility of success. The young woman who had once been laughed at for her physical weakness had discovered forms of strength that were invisible to casual observation, but essential to military success. She had learned that being a soldier meant finding ways to serve something larger than yourself, regardless of whether that service looked like traditional images of military heroism. Most importantly, she had learned that true strength was not about proving yourself to others, but about proving to yourself that you could handle whatever responsibilities were placed on your shoulders. Sarah's story had become proof that the military's greatest strength lay not in uniformity, but in its ability to find ways for people with different capabilities to contribute to shared missions. Her journey from struggling recruit to accomplished intelligence officer demonstrated that strength, courage, and military effectiveness could take many forms, and that sometimes the most important victories were achieved by people who looked nothing like traditional warriors, but possessed the intelligence, integrity, and determination that modern military operations required. In the end, those who had laughed at her weakness had learned to recognize and respect the true strength of a soldier, strength that was measured not by physical capabilities, but by the willingness to accept responsibility for protecting others and the competence to fulfill that responsibility regardless of the challenges involved. Sarah had proven that being weak in some areas did not prevent someone from being strong in the ways that mattered most, and that the military was stronger when it included people who brought different forms of strength to its missions.